Agency operation recovered a record number of children from dangerous situations right here in the Bay Area. 8 on Your Side went undercover with investigators as many of the children were being
Thanks for joining Action News 5 to 10. I'm Joy Redman. An FBI operation ended in dozens arrested in
hundreds in handcuffs after a huge bust worldwide. An FBI investigation based in Southern California.
From the highway, it looked forgettable. A row of low-budget motels outside San Antonio, faded signs, half-lit vacancy boards, office windows covered with sun-bleached posters promising weekly rates and family discounts. Nothing about it looked urgent. But by the time federal agents hit the first property, they already believed this wasn't a motel business at all. They believed it was a controlled system. And buried inside that system were 41 victims, 14 children, and a network that had been operating in plain sight while almost everyone around it saw the same thing and kept driving. At first, the complaints didn't sound connected. A missing teenage girl out of Houston, a labor trafficking tip from a church volunteer in Laredo, 3 anonymous calls to a county hotline about families living long-term in motel rooms without identification, without freedom of movement, and without any sign they were ever checking out. Separately, none of it was enough to trigger a national case. Together, it formed a pattern. Not loud, not cinematic, just consistent enough to bother the right analyst inside Homeland Security investigations, who flagged the same ownership name appearing across multiple properties tied to immigration fraud complaints, payroll anomalies, and emergency room visits involving women who refused to say where they lived. That was the first crack. The businesses were registered under different LLCs, different managers, different tax filings, different mailing addresses, but behind those layers, federal investigators kept finding the same family name attached to everything: Valdez. The Valdez family had built an image people respected. In public records, they were a success story. An immigrant family that arrived with almost nothing, worked brutal hours, bought one roadside motel, then another, then another. By 2026, they controlled 8 budget properties across Texas and southern New Mexico, mostly clustered along freight corridors and interstate exits where nobody asked why people stayed one night, 1 week, or 3 months. To the public, they were proof that hustle worked. To investigators, they were becoming something else. Because when agents started looking closer, the numbers stopped making sense. Room occupancy was unusually high, but reported revenue was inconsistent. Payroll records showed employees who did not exist. Utilities were spiking at buildings that were supposedly half full. Security camera systems had blind spots in hallways that led only to maintenance corridors and back stairwells. And on 2 properties, federal agents discovered something even stranger. Dozens of room keys were being encoded daily for rooms that had no official guest files attached to them. That raised a darker possibility. People were being housed off the books, and if that was true, the motel chain wasn't just hiding revenue, it was hiding lives. The case widened fast. The FBI joined for organized criminal activity. ICE and HSI pushed into immigration fraud and trafficking angles. The DEA came in after cash deposits and vehicle movements suggested narcotics were possibly moving through the same locations. Then the DOJ began watching from the background, waiting to see whether this was a labor exploitation case, a smuggling case, a trafficking case, or all 3 at once. What made it dangerous was how ordinary the locations were. No compounds, no razor wire, no dramatic security perimeter, just motels beside gas stations, truck stops, and family restaurants, places where exhausted travelers rolled in at midnight and rolled out at dawn, places where a child standing at an upstairs window never looked unusual. That normalcy became the cover. And the deeper agents looked, the worse it got. One of the first real breaks came from a housekeeper named Elena Rojas. She didn't walk into a federal office. She didn't call a tip line. She collapsed outside a free clinic in El Paso after a 14-hour shift, dehydrated and terrified, with a bruised wrist and a payroll envelope containing less than half the money she'd been promised. At first, she wouldn't talk. Then she heard a phrase in Spanish from a victim specialist assigned to the intake team. "You're not in trouble. You're not the target." That changed everything. Elena described being recruited near the border with promises of legal paperwork and stable work for her and her younger sister. Instead, their documents were taken. They were moved between motel properties, and they were told they owed transportation fees, room fees, food fees, and processing fees that somehow kept increasing every week. If they tried to leave, they were threatened with deportation, arrest, or violence against relatives back home. Her sister was missing. That detail snapped the case into a new category. Because now this wasn't only about labor, now there was a missing person inside the system. Agents began building timelines across the Valdez properties. Vehicle plate readers showed the same white shuttle van traveling between motels before sunrise. Phones associated with low-level managers pinged near shelters, bus depots, and known drop-off corridors. Bank activity showed cash being broken into smaller deposits below reporting thresholds. And behind the front desks, investigators found another pattern. Every property had one family room that wasn't rented online, wasn't listed publicly, and appeared to be reserved by management only. Nobody knew what those rooms were for. Not yet. Then came the first visual moment that changed the tone of the investigation. During a covert inspection tied to a local code enforcement visit in Albuquerque, an agent noticed that the dimensions of one laundry room didn't match the building plans. The wall behind 2 industrial dryers sat too far back. There should have been dead space there, but fresh paint covered one section of cinder block, and the floor tiles near it were newer than the rest. Later that night, under warrant authority, agents returned. They pulled the dryers forward. Behind them was a narrow steel door painted to match the wall. Inside was a hidden room with folding cots, bottled water, children's backpacks, a first aid kit, and a ledger filled with initials, dates, and color-coded marks nobody understood at first glance. The motel empire had just become something much darker. By then, federal surveillance had already turned up the public face of the family. Arturo Valdez, age 58, he was careful, soft-spoken, never flashy. At ribbon cuttings, he talked about faith, sacrifice, and opportunity. He donated to local food drives. He posed for photos with city council members. He gave interviews about building a legacy for his children. He never seemed like the kind of man who would run a closed network through motels, shell companies, and fear. And that was exactly why he mattered. Because investigators began to suspect Arturo wasn't simply the owner. He was the stabilizer, the respectable figure at the center of an operation designed to look like hard work while functioning like a private pipeline. Still, proving that required more than suspicion, so agents kept climbing. Financial investigators mapped over $9.6 million moving through layered accounts over 3 years. Most of it wasn't direct motel revenue. It came through cleaning vendors, maintenance firms, food supply companies, and transport services tied back to relatives, cousins, or longtime associates. On paper, it looked like expansion costs. In reality, prosecutors would later argue it was how the network washed money, paid recruiters, and kept control over people who were never meant to appear in formal books. And then the case twisted again. Because the motels were not just housing victims, they were sorting them. Some were sent into housekeeping and kitchen work, some into construction crews attached to contractors connected to the family. Some were moved toward commercial sex trafficking routes. And some children, according to later witness statements, were kept invisible while adults were forced to generate debt payments around them. That meant the motels weren't the destination. They were staging points. That realization triggered coordinated planning for raids across all 8 properties. Federal teams spent weeks building the operation. Victim specialists were placed on standby. Child forensic interview teams were pre-positioned. Translators were brought in for Spanish, Mam, Quechua, and Haitian Creole. Medical personnel were assigned to the staging areas. Every room map, stairwell, camera angle, parking lot entrance, and utility corridor was studied because agents knew one thing: if the network sensed movement too early, people would disappear. And then, just before execution, another problem surfaced. Someone inside local law enforcement may have been leaking. A motel manager in Corpus Christi abruptly wiped a phone. A transport van changed route without warning. 2 workers vanished from a property hours after a sealed warrant package was logged through a shared system. That was the mid-twist. The investigation didn't just have targets on the outside, it might have had protection on the inside. The response was immediate. Operational details were restricted, warrant teams were reshuffled, briefings were moved to federal facilities only. Only a small circle knew the final raid time, and when it came hard. Not at 4 a.m., not with sirens screaming. It started quietly, in darkness, with unmarked vehicles fanning out along access roads, while tactical teams moved into position behind truck stops, service alleys, and side lots. Then, in less than 7 minutes, all 8 properties were hit, doors breached, managers secured, hallways cleared, children located, phones seized before anyone could warn the next site. At the San Antonio property, agents found 3 women and 2 boys inside a locked utility annex, accessible only through a maintenance hallway. At a motel outside Las Cruces, a room registered as out of order contained 6 mattresses on the floor and a handwritten list of names hidden under a sink basin. In Houston, agents found a teenage girl Elena later identified as her sister Marisol, alive but severely malnourished. That was one of the moments the paperwork ended and reality hit. Marisol didn't run when agents entered. She froze. She was clutching a motel towel around her shoulders, staring at the doorway like she expected the wrong person to be standing there. A victim advocate stepped forward first, not an agent, not a uniform, just a calm voice telling her she was safe. That room alone justified the entire operation. By the end of the first sweep, federal teams had identified 41 victims across the properties. 14 were children, some were undocumented, some had pending asylum claims, some had been moved so often they didn't know what city they were in. Several adults initially lied to agents because they believed cooperation would get them deported faster than silence. That fear had been built into the system from the start, and the system did not stop at the walls. When digital evidence teams tore through seized devices, they found encrypted chats, coded booking logs, debt spreadsheets, and a shared photo archive used to monitor people at different locations. Each victim had a profile, arrival date, value, language, compliance level, family leverage, medical risk. The terminology was cold, industrial. That's when prosecutors understood what they were really looking at. Not a family business corrupted by greed, a managed exploitation network disguised as hospitality. Then came the second visual moment. In a back office behind the front desk of the flagship motel near San Antonio International Airport, agents opened what looked like a standard IT cabinet. Behind the router and electrical panel was a second hidden rack containing backup drives, network recorders, and duplicated surveillance storage not visible from the main system interface. The family hadn't just been watching parking lots and lobbies. They had been archiving control. Who met whom? Who tried to leave? Which worker spoke to outsiders? Which child appeared in hallways after curfew? Which room needed to be rotated? It was meticulous, and it pointed upward, because buried in message backups were references to someone the managers called Tio. At first, agents assumed it meant Arturo. It didn't. Tio was Daniel Valdez, Arturo's eldest nephew, a man barely seen in public and never listed on corporate filings. He handled transport routes, document retention, burner phones, and problem resolution. Witnesses described him as the one who enforced debts, moved people overnight, and decided when families were split apart for compliance. Arturo built the face, Daniel maintained the fear. That split finally made the enterprise make sense. But the deepest damage was still unfolding through the stories of the people who survived it. Elena and Marisol were only one part of it. Another was a 12-year-old boy identified in court records as JM. He had been moving from motel to motel with his mother for nearly 8 months. He told forensic interviewers he knew not to look directly at managers, not to ask when they were leaving, and not to cry when his mother was taken out at night to clean rooms that weren't really being cleaned. He had started memorizing exit signs because he thought one day he might need to run without being seen. That kind of detail changes how a case is understood. It stops being about charges on paper. It becomes a map of what control feels like from the inside. The DOJ announcement that followed focused on the arrests, the evidence, and the rescue operation. But behind the public language was a more uncomfortable truth. This had lasted as long as it did because the system was built to exploit what most people ignore: cheap motels, transient populations, language barriers, fear of immigration authorities, small counties with limited oversight, and the assumption that if a business looks legitimate enough, nobody wants to ask what's happening behind the office door. That's why the case kept expanding even after the raids. Investigators began reviewing property inspectors, payroll processors, and outside contractors. One county deputy resigned after federal interviews. A code enforcement clerk was suspended. A private accountant tied to multiple Valdez entities stopped cooperating and later retained criminal counsel. What began as a motel case was now pulling on a thread that touched institutions beyond the family itself. And that may have been the most disturbing reveal of all. Networks like this don't survive on secrecy alone. They survive on selective blindness. Arturo Valdez was eventually charged alongside Daniel and several property managers in a sweeping federal indictment covering conspiracy, harboring, trafficking-related offenses, money laundering, forced labor, document fraud, and child endangerment counts. More arrests followed, more victims were identified, civil asset forfeiture actions targeted the motels, the transport fleet, and a web of accounts linked to the operation. But even with the headlines, the numbers, and the images of agents leading suspects out in handcuffs, the hardest part of the story was what came after. 41 victims had to be stabilized. Children had to be placed somewhere safe. Interpreters had to explain rights to people who had spent months being told they had none. Trauma teams had to build trust with survivors trained to expect punishment whenever they spoke. A raid can break a system in one morning. Recovering from that system takes much longer, and that is where stories like this usually fade from public attention. The cameras leave, the tape comes down. The motel signs still stand for a while before court orders catch up. Drivers pass by and barely remember what happened there. But for the people inside, the place doesn't disappear that quickly. They remember the lock clicks, the hallway footsteps, the coded knocks, the way every ordinary object became part of control. A key card, a towel, a cleaning cart, a vacancy sign glowing red in the dark. That's why this case mattered beyond the arrests, because it exposed how exploitation can wear the mask of ordinary business and still function for years within systems designed to catch exactly this kind of abuse. It showed how a family empire can be built not only on money, but on silence, and it showed that sometimes the most dangerous operation in a city is the one that doesn't look dangerous at all, just cheap, just busy, just temporary, until somebody starts connecting the dots. And when they finally do, the question is never just how many people were found. It's how many signs were missed before anyone came looking. If a network like this can operate behind front desks, business licenses, and family branding people instinctively trust, what else passes as ordinary right up until the door finally opens?